I would like to see Milledgeville someday, and a lot more of Georgia. I've only been to Atlanta and Decatur, so I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more of that state. Beautiful state. I'm going to read some poems from White Blood, a lyric of Virginia. Prelude. You're on a train, and your ancestors are in the quiet car. The quiet car is locked with a password you can't decrypt. You're a professional password decryptor, but your ancestors are demolition experts. You're wearing black tactical gear, and your ancestors are wearing black tactical gear. You're dashing through each component, slamming doors open when your ancestors lay small explosives. As heat expands within the carriage, you escape through a picture window. You climb to the top of the train, and your ancestors rappel down the sides. You're rappelling down one side of the train. When you glimpse your ancestors above you, they leap from carriage to carriage as if weightless, as if drifting, as if curling tongues of snow. You cling to the side of the train as each of your ancestors lifts away from you. They float into the cloud of themselves. In the rushing light, you perceive them as hundreds of slow snake doctors. Oh, you begin. What your results mean. Western Africa, 28%. The West African you is a hunter. Try. Carry this. The West African you has split and expanded, a mixture historic as a gene. The West African component of your lineage, the out of Africa event, the New World slave seen in this genetic print. You are likely a mixture, a cluster, a high number. Your DNA has roots that cluster and spread and trade and carry. The West African you spanning more than more regions of time in people. Oh, between this cluster and this cluster, an African O. Oh, Niger and Chad. Oh, fingerprint. African, you span most of Africa, African America, African diaspora, and the southern African forests out of Africa, east, south, and then southeast. Within Africa, throughout Africa, the historic African world. Well, so, well, so. Next couple poems are from a section called Albemarle. Now, Albemarle County is the county that I happen to be broadcasting from. It's in central Virginia. It is where Charlottesville, the University of Virginia, is located, and also the site of Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home on the mountain in Albemarle County. Instructions for time travel. You must go through Mr. Jefferson, along his row of chinaberry trees, behind the ruined smokehouse, in unmarked tracts under field stones, with no carvings, no monuments, with a few leaves shadowing the mulch, near scattered weeds in sunken lines, while the sun walks in the day, at the end of the day, in an oval of brushed earth, just as the soft path finishes, under branches where the dead are always saying what they always say, right about me. Monticello House Tour. What they never say is Mr. Jefferson's still building. He's just using clear bricks now for his turrets and halls, for the balconies rounding his palace in transparent loops of dug air. After death, it's so easy to work. No one sees him go out from the residence, his gloves full of quiet mortar. Mr. Jefferson's coat is narrow as daybreak, his long sleeves drag in the muck as he minces his turf. You know the room you were born in. It's part of the tour. Hundreds of rooms unfolding for miles, orchards alive in the parlor. Remember that gold chair you loved, the one with a face like a lion, especially in late winter when mother sat with you in her pink gown humming? As it happens, Mr. Jefferson built you that lion. He drew your time in prudent proportions. You have one job, to fit the design he keeps spinning. Your whole life is laced through a ring of similar finds. Look, it's all mothers in pink gowns humming. And when writing this book, I was thinking about different ways to talk about Jefferson. I thought about, or addressing him or referring to him. I thought about calling him President Jefferson or Jefferson TJ, which was the informal way that graduates of the University of Virginia would refer to him. But the slightly more formal way, which I also learned at the University of Virginia, was Mr. Jefferson. And as soon as I wrote Mr. Jefferson, it sounded correct. It sounded like the right way to refer to him. This poem is called "If You Tell Them Sally Hemings Was 3/4 White." They'll ask how dark she looked. When you compare her memory to an earthen porringer brimming with late sun, they'll say, "Fetch that porringer now." They'll make you fill it up with rain so they can regard themselves. You'll watch them swerve their visages. As they regard themselves, they might mark a thing or two. They'll probably mark a thing or two which makes them shiver. "But how'd you say she looked?" they'll ask, patting their foreheads. "Not like you, since you're twice as black." Of course, that's not quite right. But as you open your mouth to speak, you'll catch them watching too close. You'll want to fix a drink then. You'll drink. They'll probably get sleepy. "Tell us what you know about Sally." They'll yawn, not sensing how that story swells under your tongue, a sweet. Remember, sweet, how it dissolves their boot prints from the drive. Now, try your own green lungs. Like this, like this. There's many a slip. La cuisinière bourgeoise. Mr. Jefferson loved early green peas almost as much as I love complaining. I pick at his recipes and their French alphabets larded in light. We know Mr. Jefferson loved early green peas almost translucent and gone by July. Didn't the French believe delight and temperance marry in the mouth? I'll hold my peace as much as I love complaining. I pick at the recipes Mr. Jefferson loved early green peas almost. Essay in architecture. And by the way, that's something that comes from Jefferson's own writing. In writing to a friend, he referred to Monticello as his essay in architecture. And of course, we're reminded that the term essay doesn't always have to refer to a written document. It actually comes from a French word, which means to try. So an essay is an attempt at something. And so Monticello, in Jefferson's formulation, is his essay in architecture. The human face, its pine doors painted like mahogany. Human face with horses under each veranda. Perfect parquet tetragons of the human face. Human face still legible in old French. Sealed closet of the human face lit by oculus, design face, tinker face, factory face. Twine and bare wood comprising a pulley system for the human face. Woodworked face with sunbeams settling in. Revolving buffet supporting the human face. Entire pewter plate collection in the face. Human face as soup tureen, as paint chip, as spit jack. Smoke rings textured like the human face. Human face cured, human face pickled, human face brushed with olive oil, anchovies, and parmesan. Green floor of the dome room just above the human face. Floating view of the face, its quarter farms, rough cabins dotting a sloped face, partly visible. Human face built to resemble a great clock, great pendulum drawing faces in the air. That poem dealt with a lot of objects and aspects of the architecture of Monticello. There's a great clock, which if you've been, you'll know that he used cannonballs actually for weights. And so each hour, a cannonball would drop through a hole in the floor. Um, the hole had to be dug because the hole had to be dug in the floor because he had actually miscalculated like how many cannonballs you would need for an entire day's movement. But when you look over the door, the main door to the residence, you don't necessarily see the cannonballs and stuff right away. You actually just see the clock, which compared to the cannonballs is actually quite small. Fits over the lintel of the door, and there's a pendulum that swings. And that clock has been swinging. That pendulum has been swinging, cutting the same slice of air for over 200 years. And of course, Jefferson was a great host. He had many guests. He also owned many enslaved people. And one of the people that he had formerly enslaved, when he came back to the residence, he had occasion to come back to the residence, recognized the clock. The clock has been there for the whole time. So I wanted to write about that feeling and that continuity. Okay, this will be the last poem I read from that section. The Shop at Monticello. I'm a black body in this commonwealth which turned black bodies into money. Now I have money to spend on little trinkets to remind me of this fact. I'm a money machine, and my body constitutes the commonwealth. I spend and spend in order to support this. I support this mountain with my black money. Strange mountain in late bloom, strange mansion built on mountains of wealth. I spend so much I'm late for the tour where I'm a blooming black dollar sign. I look good in the dome room prowling its high gloss floor. It's common to desire such flooring for my own home, but owning a home is still strange. My blackness makes strange tools for a living, rakes the strangeness like dirt. I like to rake my hands over merchandise, bayberry votives, English hyssop, and crisp sachets. I like this engraved pewter bookmark so much suddenly I line up for it, clenching my upright fist. I pay cash to prove myself no shoplifter. Still, I abscond with my black feelings, crisp toast points dunked in fig jam. On one hand, I must think very highly of myself to come here. Then again, that sounds like something I would say. What your results mean, Northwestern Europe, 12%. This region, shh, 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 early episodic habit, region divided into small percentages of centuries. It is a long advent, we now know. Region of rope, much more than a region, the spread of this in small ages. Avian man migrating south and east over the last Latin centuries. This region of composite character grew from mix and tick. O ion subdivided into empire. Much more than an historical population, it is the South, ethnic, political, so small. This region, a graphical character, O settler, farmer, O biographical region of one. This region of glaciation, spread of settlers, the last people of European ancestry, from that we part. Region migrating from region. This next section is named Louisa, and that's because there's a county that's right next to you. It's adjacent to Albemarle County. It's called Louisa County, and that is actually where all my grandmother's people are from. And they were alive, all going all the way back to when Jefferson was was here, and even before that, back to the earliest days of English settlement in Virginia. So I'm descended from the earliest African American communities here in Virginia. So these poems are about my grandmother's family, which is named Smith. A Guide to the Louisa County Free Negro and Slave Records, 1770 to 1865. The first box is for all the good white men, the ones who freed their slaves on Christmas. It's always Christmas in the first box. The day Delpha shall go out, the day Viney shall go out. These good white men only desire the guardian care of those underage. After that, they shall go out just as Winnie shall go out at the age of 21, entirely free from me or mine or any person whatsoever. Delpha, Viney, and Winnie shall go out on Christmas Day. The first box slides open to show their certificates. The good white men of this county, believing that all men are by nature equally free, have left many of these. One certificate is for Viney, one for Winnie, one for Delpha, but these good white men can only free the slaves they truly own. One man observes the above mentioned Negroes are disputed in their titles to me, namely Delpha, Viney, and Winnie. He doesn't say more about the dispute. He doesn't say what happens on Christmas Day. This good white man has said all three should go out precisely on Christmas Day. But now it is different. It is very different now, even though Christmas has come. The good white man writes, I only free as to my right and title given under my hand. The box slides open to show certificate after certificate. It's Christmas. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. You want to know who owned us and where, but when you type, your searches reveal no results. Bondage was grown folks' business, then old folks. We saw no reason to hum old master's name to our grandchildren or point out his overgrown gates, but you want to know who owned us and where we got free. You keep typing our names into oblongs of digital white. You plant a Unicode tree and climb up into grown folks' business. You know old folks don't want you rummaging here, so you pile sweet jam in your prettiest dish. You light candles and pray. Tell me who owned you and where I might find your graves. Little child, we're at rest in the acres we purchased. Those days of bondage were old folks' business. The grown folks buried us deep. Only a few of our names survive. We left you this, sudden glints in the grass. The rest is grown folks' business, we say. Yet you keep asking, who owned us? And then, because I can see the clock on my computer, the clock on the wall, I'll just read one more poem, and then Irene will help me field some questions from all of you if you'd like to ask questions. This is the last poem in the book, and it's called Psalm, and I wrote it for the city of Louisville, where I spent almost a decade teaching and living. And this poem is written in memory of two elderly people who were killed right before I left Louisville. They were killed at a Kroger. A white supremacist came to the Kroger and began shooting, and he killed these two people. Psalm. Dear Lord, dear high remembrancer, dear providential love, have mercy. Have mercy, thou surveyor of wildflowers, assessor of royal and exquisite bee realms. Have mercy, ledger, who tracks us in the night, who measures without speaking our dark trespasses. For nothing here survives, not the gold-legged deer browsing the bleached office park at dawn, nor the minute finch on her branch of long division, but thou, absorb it all. O gazer, Be kind in thy absorbing calculus. Won't be long before thy reckoning curve arrives at the junction of our error. How, beneath thy mineral eye, we walk abroad, forgetting thee, cartographer of sparrows.
Wonderful. Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question or you have something we already have a question. Could you discuss for Martin Lamming what your results mean? Western Africa, 28%. Could you discuss the space on the page in this poem? Your reading did not reflect the degree of pause I might have expected. He said, when I read it out loud to myself, I imagined a very different tempo for the poem's reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting observation. The wonderful thing about poetry is that it lives on the page, and the voicing that I give to it as the author is my own, but it's certainly not the one that you have to have in your own mind when you're reading. From a formal perspective, to answer the question in a literal way, the poems that are all titled What Your Results Mean are what we might call found poems, in the sense that the text that forms the poems is not a text that I composed. It's actually an erasure of the little paragraph that you get at the end of your DNA test where it says where your DNA is from. Now, when I took my test, because I have such mixed ancestry, I got many, many, many of these little paragraphs, but so yours might be different, but I got a paragraph about Western Africa, and it was all about the migration patterns and the deep history of that particular region of Africa. And then I got another one for Northwestern Europe and another for Eastern Africa and lots of other places. But those are the three that I chose for my poem. And when you make an erasure poem, what you do is you look at the found text, the existing text, and you erase words that you don't want for whatever reason, or words that you think wouldn't speak to the poem. And you create the poem out of the words that remain. So the words that are in this poem are placed where they are, not to give an indication necessarily of the pacing of the reading, but simply because that is where they appeared in the original text.
I've seen
So
yes.
Yeah.
I know, now I understand. That makes perfect sense now, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the benefit of it is that you get to keep the spacing. I think is visually interesting, and it also looks a little bit like the sort of DNA ladder. The words that we use come together to form some kind of narrative about our genetic background, in the same way that those four, I guess, is it proteins, come together to form the like DNA of our cells. So, I just wanted to preserve like where they were in the original text. And for that, I didn't invent that technique. You might find a similar technique of erasure if you read Ronald Johnson's Radios, which is an early 80s, very important erasure of Paradise Lost, of Milton's Paradise Lost. So Ronald Johnson took the first 4 books of Paradise Lost and he created an erasure that looks like mine, or mine looks like his. And what he did was he whited out the words that he didn't want in his poem, but the words that are in the poem are preserved in the original places that they were in Milton's text.
I've often seen this kind of a poem with a page where the words that were selected are in white and all around it's blacked out.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In this book, it makes a lot more sense. It's really more appropriate, I think, to do it, reverse it, and let the words be, standing out through against all that whiteness, all that white space that's behind. Mm-hmm. Okay, that explains it very well for me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chika Yanegwe. Chika, where are you? Would you want to ask this directly, Chica?
Yeah, my video isn't on because I'm having, no, you ask it, Irene, because I'm having
Okay.
problems with audio.
Okay. Chica asks, thank you so much for such beautiful and touching poetry. Which poets do you read for inspiration?
You know, I read all kinds of things and not just poetry. So I was explaining to the students, you know, just about like 2 hours ago, I was explaining some of the poets that I read. You know, Natasha Trethewey is an important poet to me, but I also read, you know, I also sort of remember the kind of vibrations and the resonances of like Shakespeare, you know, or Dante, like the canonical poets that I read in school, alongside the sort of, you know, exciting younger poets of color that I might read. I recently taught a great book called Mend by a wonderful African American poet named Koya Fagan Maples, and it was all about the. I mean, the basis of the poems have to do with Dr. Sims and his experiments on enslaved women in Alabama during the Civil War period. So right now I'm kind of interested in poets that are working in what we might call a documentary mode, or are using archival techniques and going into archives and looking at historical records and making poems that deal with complex aspects of history.
Thank you.
Are there others who'd be interested in asking questions? One of the things you had mentioned earlier in the earlier session is that you were born in Baltimore, which is sort of a border city in many ways. And then you lived in Kentucky, which is sort of a border state. How has that affected how you perceive this issue of race and background and being in the South?
Yeah, I think that I'm still formulating what I think about that. And it's the writing itself that actually helps me think about some of these complex issues. Growing up in Baltimore, I attended, you know, Catholic schools that are predominantly white. I myself am Catholic. I'm half Italian as well. So that was a huge part of my history and my upbringing. My mother is African American, originally from DC. And like I explained to y'all while I was reading, my grandmother's family is from Central Virginia. My grandfather was born in Manassas. So there's all this like Virginia stuff going on. But over time, my African American family kind of migrated away from Virginia and ended up much more in a mid-Atlantic space, DC and Baltimore and things like that. I think that's probably taken me my whole life to understand that even if I didn't understand the racial landscape I was in, that I was always in some sort of racial landscape. Baltimore likes to think of itself as a Yankee city when it wants to, and then it likes to think of itself as a Southern city when it wants to. So they say it's the northernmost Southern city because it is south of the Mason-Dixon line, but it does have a border kind of feel to it. It wants to be cosmopolitan, you know, but then like Louisville, it can also be kind of a segregated city. And I think that what I want to do as an artist is to just know as much as I can about the history of the places where I reside and the places where I am from, you know? So I want to be able to claim all these aspects of my identity. And I feel that in order to do that, claiming and learning have to go together. So I've started asking a lot more questions of like my own family and of the archive itself, you know? Wondering like why was I born in Baltimore? That makes me understand my parents' stories and how they met. Why, you know, my mother's from DC, but my grandmother, her family all come from Central Virginia. Why did that movement happen? And so as you ask questions, you move further back and back and back in time, you know? And I was able, you know, I feel like knowledge is just very empowering. I would like to be able to occupy space as a person of color with knowledge of where I come from and what spaces I can lay claim to. You know, I think that growing up as a person of color, you're kind of always told that you don't belong, and that the American story is not your story. You have some other story from elsewhere that you should go learn about outside, you know, or you're not really part of America. You're not really as American as somebody whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower, for example, right? Of which I do have one friend whose ancestors did come on the Mayflower. You know, it was real. The Mayflower was a real thing. You know, and so you sort of feel like you don't have any roots, or you don't have an actual history. Well, once you start looking back just a couple generations, you know, my African American ancestors, they had farms, they had land, they had places where they lived, and they belonged to churches. They founded churches. They buried their loved ones on their farmland, or they buried their loved ones in specific churchyards. They were part of vibrant communities, you know, some of which still exist in some form. So I think that my relationship to the, you know, my relationship to the issue of race probably doesn't have as much to do with being from like border areas as it seems like America is full of these kinds of crossroads and mixtures and contradictions. And I think that we should just all learn a lot more about it.
Right. Right. Well, we have a couple of questions. I know Shannon asked a question about erasure poems, and then we have Katie Simon after that. So Shannon, do you want to unmute and join us?
Sure.
Irene, can I sneak in my question? This is Denisha.
Sure, Denisha.
Yeah, I had a question and it kind of got lost in there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. And you kind of already covered it, Kiki. I asked, what about your family history inspires your poetry? And you kind of were already touching on that. But is there anything else that you weren't able to share about your family history that inspires your poetry?
Yeah, it's a great question because, I mean, I always try to write from my own life. You know, I published 3 books prior to this, and they were all very personal to me, and they had to do with things that were going on in my own life. This was a book that involved me in my own life, but the inspiration for it was actually about my family and not me directly. I first got the idea for this book after my grandmother passed away, the one she was born in DC, but her whole family's from Louisa. She passed away she was only 46 days away from her 100th birthday when she passed away in 2015. And she was my last grandparent, the 4th one, right? So after she passed, I realized that a whole generation for my family had passed, and that if I wanted to learn more about her, I mean, I asked her as many questions as I could, but I knew that if I wanted to know more, I would have to use research skills. I'd have to do research the way I had been taught as a student in the humanities. And so then I thought that I would write a book just about her life and her accomplishments, which were many. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse. Then she worked for the government. She worked for the Treasury. She had a good, one of those good government jobs in DC. My grandfather worked for the Defense Department. At that point, it was called the War Department. And they were amazing people, and they were a really cool couple, my grandparents. But as I started looking back and back and back, this whole other landscape started to come up, and I started to see particularly a generation of ancestors who were born prior to the Civil War and then came of age during the war and lived the rest of their lives as free people. I became really fascinated by that particular generation and wanted to do some more writing about Virginia and about like the embedded histories of those areas, which I always knew was personal to me, but which I really hadn't felt empowered to explore until after my grandmother's passing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Denisha. Shannon?
Thank you so much for everything you're sharing. And I was in the craft talk earlier where we were talking about the erasure poem, and I was asking if there were other examples that might be long form or prose versions of that, because I write creative nonfiction, but would like to borrow this concept. And there are a couple examples in the chat, so thank you all for that. But Kiki, if you have other examples, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I'm just seeing that somebody mentioned Tom Phillips' The Humament. That is something that I've studied and actually got a chance to go to London and see a couple pages from a Humament on display at the Royal Academy, I think. And the thing about Tom Phillips is that he didn't just do his he's a visual artist, and he wasn't just he didn't just do a Humament one time. He was doing, he did this erasure using opaque watercolor of a 19th century book called A Human Document. So a humament comes from a human document. But every now and then he'll take a page out of that same book and he'll like erase it again, or he'll do a new version of it. So there's something about the renewability of erasure that I really like. And in a nonfiction context, I really couldn't tell. I don't know if I know of any like nonfiction writers doing nonfiction erasure, though I'm interested in that idea. That would be really cool. But Mary Ruffle has some really cool erasures. She's a poet. Trying to think about like who else you might look at. Again, I would just go all the way back to somebody like Ronald Johnson and check out that erasure from Paradise Lost.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. Katie?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the beautiful poems. I really enjoyed it. And so my question's about the prose poem you read tonight, and then just prose poetry in general.
Sure.
I wonder if it was so powerful when you read it. And then when I looked at it, I have your book here. I was like, I just had questions like, what makes you decide to write a prose poem versus lines or couplets? Is there something about the content that would inspire? And also, what makes a prose poem different than a paragraph for you? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a paragraph, but it felt like a poem when you read it. It felt really, so it's just something I've always been curious about, is the prose poem and
Sure. Yeah.
Genre. Yeah.
Prose poetry is a really cool form of poetry. It originated, this is what I've been taught. So there may be experts in the audience that have like a more granular understanding of this, but what I was taught is that it comes from turn of the century French poetry. People that would have been in the surrealist-ish schools and playing surrealist games in order to sort of like generate poetry. And the prose poem in France came out of an exhaustion with rhyme. French being a very rhyme-rich language in which you can just make rhymes very easily. And so in order to break the monotony of rhyme in French, you would get these prose poems. And of course, then many times in a prose poem, the poem takes some kind of surreal flight, which also owes, I think, its genesis to that period of time and that community of artists in France. But the cool thing about the prose poem as it comes to English is that, English itself is not a rhyme-rich language in the way that French is. Some people say maybe it's a rhyme-poor language, but what I think is that English has a lot of texture and resonance to it, and that those textures and resonances are served by prose. So, when you're writing a prose poem, instead of thinking about the line as the primary unit of meaning, it's actually the sentence, right? And the sentence can take up any number of lines. When you write in a prose poem, you're just going from margin to margin, and you're not breaking the lines, right? As soon as you break a line, you have a lineated poem, and you have a poem that is using the line as its unit of meaning. In a prose poem, you're very conspicuously not writing in lines, you're writing in sentences instead. And the prose poem has to have a certain kind of movement to it. In poetry, we talk about a turn, which is a moment in a poem that like where the poem starts to make its primary argument, or where it switches its tonality or texture, or where the big reveal happens often in a turn. And a lot of times in the lineated poem, a turn happens between lines, between two lines. But in a prose poem, it has to happen between sentences. And my philosophy of prose poetry is that a turn must happen between every sentence. So the difference between a prose poem and like a piece of microfiction or just a paragraph is that the prose poem is very aware of language as a medium, like it is actually a physical thing that is in the world that is making the poem happen, and it's like super aware that language is its material. And the prose poem turns after every sentence, you know, so it sort of cuts the page or incisors the page, or it skis down the page in a way that a paragraph doesn't always have to do. Now, of course, there are wonderful writers that, you know, I just read, I was just saying to the students that I just reread The Great Gatsby, and I love that. I love that book, and because I really read it like a series of prose poems. You know, Fitzgerald can write a paragraph and it does feel like a poem. So Fitzgerald can do it. Fitzgerald knows the materiality of language, and he also knows the power of a sentence, you know? So it's like when you're reading a prose poem, pay attention to what happens as one sentence moves into another sentence, you know? That's something that poets have to be very, very conscious of, so that by the end of the prose poem, you end up at like a destination that is different from where you began, you know?
Thank you so much.
Martin Lamon, you have another request. Do you want to open it up? Have to unmute you. There you
Hi,
go.
Kiki. I love your poem, The Origins of Butler Smith.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't choose to read that one, and I wonder if you would read it and then talk about it a little bit.
Sure. Okay. All right, The Origins of Butler Smith. B is for bright, a boy. No birthmarks, but his hair inclined to straightness, and his nose more like a white man's. B also for the bluets you dreamed, crowding the drive leading up to the old farm you've crossed 2 states to see. What'll you do if you find no parcel in the name of B at the courthouse, in the relic room, at the indicated plat? So sorry you didn't already know the yard where chickens pecked and patted under the eye of Granddaddy B. So sorry you missed him on his way. He must be burning high above your head, a comet or worse, the story of a comet somebody told you. Wrong comet, wrong county, wrong dates spiraled into the roll book, a roll of microfilm for every year you can't confirm. How to confirm a certain smokehouse not marked on any grid. Lucky bee, spangled bee, this is not where you begin. So this poem is about an actual ancestor of mine, Butler Smith from Louisa County, and he is my great-great-grandfather. He was born probably in October of 1864. So, you know, right, I mean, 6 months or something before Appomattox, you know? And so he would have been born in some circumstance of enslavement. His mother's name was Harriet with 2 T's on the end. She's also from Louisa. And for a long time, Butler was the earliest ancestor that anybody in my grandmother's family could mention or like knew about. So he's my grandmother's grandfather. And he was, you know, somebody that I, of course, did not meet, but I was always very curious about. And I knew that he had his own land and his own farm. Turned out he inherited that from his mother, Harriet. But he's also kind of a slippery figure because there's like fewer records of him than I wanted there to be. I wanted, you know, there to be a record of his birth, for example, but because he was probably born enslaved, his name is not like recorded anywhere officially, you know? And I wanted there to be a record of his death. He probably died sometime in the early 1940s, actually. But there is no record of his actual death, so I don't know his cause of death. However, I've seen his tombstone, photograph of the family graveyard, so I know where he's buried. But I can't actually find that graveyard. I've hiked into the woods. It's now owned by a stranger. And the last time I went there was soon after the 2016 election, and things were just kind of weird and felt kind of weird. And even though there's a law in Virginia that says that any descendant may access a family burial ground, even if it's on someone else's land, I traipsed back there like twice and then realized that it probably wasn't wise to keep going back there. So, he's a figure who was important to my family. My grandmother had memories of him. I'm very interested in his story, but he continues to elude me, so I wanted to write a poem about what it was like to look into his history and see him. He's sort of like a moving target for me.
Oh, thank you. So nice to know more about that story. Thank you.
Anything else as we wrap up? Kiki, thank you so much. This has been so enjoyable tonight.
Thank you.
Warmed up a cold night for all of us.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Good to see you all. Take care. Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.